Hey YouTube, I'm Mr. Terry, a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. A few weeks ago, I had covered a cynical historian video about slavery myths. And that video and that topic was really popular. Got a lot of responses and a lot of you guys contributing down in the comments with your own kind of thoughts about the history of slavery. So to kind of keep on that path, I wanted to check out some more stuff that talks about the history of slavery. And this video was recommended to me, and it's titled The Truth About the White Slave Trade. Now, this is from the channel Forgotten History, and I want to say thank you to them because then I reached out to see if they were cool with me filming a reaction. They were supportive of that. So I'm not exactly sure what's going to be talked about here. It's about the white slave trade. So it's either got to be about, white people conducting slave trade or the history of white people as slaves. All right, the original video link is down below. Please make sure you support that by giving a view. If you like their video, make sure you subscribe to them so you can get more content. And let's get started. All right, this video is really popular. So it came out 7 months ago and has 1.3 million views. So it's definitely got to be comment worthy. So let's check this out. Make sure that you provide your own comments down below. Love to hear what you think about this and, the topic, I guess, about slavery and especially white slavery in general. All right, let's do this. 10th Legion pictures. Yeah, I saw in their credits there a lot of
slavery is as old as human civilization, dating back beyond recorded history, and it exists even still today. Every culture on every continent practiced some form of slavery.
True.
Whether it was serfdom, indentured servitude, or collective peasantry.
Yeah, that is true.
However, when the slave trade is mentioned, people normally think of the black African slave trade to the Western Hemisphere.
True.
During the colonial period, from 1500 to the mid-1800s.
Well, it's so much of that is a result of, and it says people, say that it's going to be, as Americans, right? So naturally, Americans are going to focus and think more about, the slavery that is impacted directly, like the United States. So it's going to be like that. But you're going to hear a lot more talk about slavery if you are in another culture, because like, again, he said, slavery is so deep in cultural history, especially since the agricultural era, when demand for farming and farmers and battling and fighting for farmable land definitely added to that, and to warfare in general, by the way, which is where historically most slaves have come from,
as practiced by the European colonial powers. Estimates range from 10 to 13 million Africans being brought to the New World.
Right. With millions, probably at least 2 million probably, that died on the Middle Passage, meaning on the way to, the Americas. They never survived the trip to the Americas. Remember also, too, in the transatlantic slave trade, most slaves went to the Caribbean. That was not most, but the highest percentage went to the Caribbean and Brazil. In fact, in like the British colonies, is very, very few actually in the percentage, maybe 5 to 10%.
10 million surviving to be sold in North and South America, as well as in the Caribbean islands. Of this
Caribbean
number,
had the largest percentage.
The best estimate.
The reason for that is because the native populations almost 100% died out. There was no really labor force there, so they came from Africa and were well adapted to the climates of the Caribbean, coming from Africa, to be able to produce sugar, especially, which was the most lucrative crop.
Is that 450,000 went to the British, French, and Spanish colonies in what is now the United States and Caribbean.
Spain lower because of a higher percentage of surviving people.
The rest going to the Spanish colonies in South America. Slavery still exists in the world, yet most of the major powers ignore the fact and refuse to even acknowledge that it still exists. It is still quite active.
A big reason for that is the large varying definitions of modern day slavery.
Yet, 6 decades before the American Civil War, a war was fought by the United States on foreign shores to try and stop the white slave trade. What was the white slave trade? Does it still exist? Who were the Barbary pirates? What was the result of American intervention? How did it occur, and what was the aftermath?
Those interventions were going to be especially based on economic reasons, though, not as much of abolition, especially if you're talking about the early 1800s. I mean, the United States kind of got semi-involved in the Haitian Revolution, which was a slave revolt, but not for like abolition reasons, on moral grounds, you know what I mean?
And How did 9 U.S. Marines and their mercenaries make history and give birth to a legendary fighting force while also ending the white slave trade in North Africa?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former soldier, Marine Corps Scout Sniper, history professor, historian, and book author. And we've answered these questions
Get rid of his credentials.
Other
Done a lot.
issues
The work.
on this segment of Forgotten History.
I don't know much about his takes or opinions, anything like that, potential bias, you know.
During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the world was on fire as France and Britain were
Napoleon.
engaged in the Napoleonic Wars, which was another
Who brought back
series of
slavery.
conflicts just like the 7 Years' War, again involving every nation in Europe. The 7 Years' War was also known as the French and Indian War in the United States. Both these conflicts...
Well, it's called that, the theater of it that was fought in the U.S., because it's from the British perspective of that they were fighting the French and Indians, which of course the British had Indians too. The war there in the Midwest, the United States, pitted Native American nations against each other to side with the power that they, believe would give them the best deal, I guess you would say, in the post-war world.
Were fought on every continent and on every ocean and in every colony. Even during these protracted wars, the transatlantic slave trade continued. It was big business. While the European powers were destroying each other, Thomas Jefferson became the third president of the United States from March 4th, 1801 to March 4th, 1809.
Of course, massive slave owner. You guys
and
know
he
that.
has several major issues to contend with. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 from France doubled the size of the United States. The Yazoo territorial disputes in western Georgia were hotly contested.
Yeah.
The
What to do about
launching of the
slavery.
Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804 to explore the newly acquired country, and the contested issue of slavery.
Yeah,
In
because it's, up to that point, there was an even balance of slave states and non-slave states. So leaders had, and people had kind of put that off, right? Like something like a civil war of trying to make an official policy, because they're like, if there's even amount of slave states and non-slave states, okay, it just kicked the ball further down the road, of course. So with Western expansion, that of course, had to be fully addressed by the 1860s with the, Civil War.
1806, Jefferson denounced the international slave trade as a violation of human rights and called upon Congress to criminalize it. Congress responded by approving the act prohibiting importation of slaves the following year.
Well, yeah, that was in the Constitution. That was the part of kind of the Great Compromise, right? Because, Southern states wanted to be able to use slaves towards the population required to get more representatives in Congress. So you get the 3/5 compromise, of course. So a slave represented 3/5 of a person when it comes to representation for getting representatives in Congress. But then as part of that too, is the slave trade was going to end. They were ending it in 20 years after the Constitution. That the slave trade would end, not slavery would end, but importation of slaves. Because naturally, the more slaves that would come in, that would upset the balance of population in areas that have slaves or not.
No longer could slaves be brought from Africa, although slavery was still legal in the United States. Then there were also the
that was
rising
already agreed
tensions
upon by
between the United
Jefferson's
States
time.
and Great Britain, which dominated the final years of Jefferson's second term, as the Royal Navy had been seizing American merchant ships and impressing sailors. However, one situation which has gone largely unnoticed in history was Jefferson being the first president to send the military overseas into direct action: the war against the Barbary pirates. For decades prior to Jefferson's accession to office, the Barbary Coast pirates of North Africa had been capturing foreign merchant and warships, stealing their valuable cargoes, and enslaving crew members, while often demanding huge ransoms for their release. Many of these ships and crews were American. Before independence, American merchant ships were protected from the Barbary pirates by the naval and diplomatic influence of Great Britain, which had threatened the use of military force should their ships be molested. However, that American protection came to an end after the colonies won their independence. The Barbary pirates also attacked the coastal northern Mediterranean,
They're from movies.
launching attacks against France, Italy, and Sicily, kidnapping women as white slaves, primarily and whenever possible, notable wealthy persons and ships for ransom. In their feverish search for white women slaves, a few pirates even went as far as the coast of Iceland, raiding inland to kidnap women and bring them back to North Africa.
Well, it shows as slave trade is winding down, that slave traders weren't going to, their whole way of life depended on that, because it was so profitable, the slave trade, that now they're going out and doing it on their own. I mean, piracy in general changed shape around this era too, because, piracy was such a big deal, especially during the age of conquest and colonization. And, governments would sponsor it, right? You might have heard of the term, I'm a privateer, which is basically a pirate that is employed by a government. And countries were doing that, right? It's where like Sir Francis Drake got his notoriety. He was the most successful privateer because he was supported by, the British crown. So they had eventually agreed to stop doing that. These countries are like, hey, let's stop sending privateers against each other and stealing each other's wealth. So what ended up happening with those pirates is those pirates then, a lot of them, those privateers, I should say, became more like independent pirates, because obviously it was still very lucrative to loot ships and stuff like that. So they're just like, oh, government A, you're not going to support us anymore? Okay, we'll just do it ourselves. And similar thing happening here is the slave trade's ending. The slave traders are like, well, it doesn't mean we're going to stop doing it. We'll go do it on our own, rather than just dealing directly with these states that are paying for and participating in the slave trade. So it's the kind of just history of piracy in general and how it shifted
North
to
African slave
independent
markets thrived as,
contracting.
under
I don't know.
Islamic law, known as Sharia. Although fellow Muslims could not be enslaved,
That is correct.
non-Muslims could be and were.
That is
Over
correct.
a period of more than 300 years, it is estimated that 1 million white Europeans, to include those captured at sea as well as through land raids abroad, were enslaved.
Way more before that too. I mean, it does look like he's focusing on the same era of the transatlantic slave trade, but it was a really important point. Hopefully you all, if you didn't know that, is according to Islamic law, slavery is permitted, except you don't, you're not allowed to enslave other Muslims. So they would focus on sub-Saharan Africa and also Eastern European Christian Europe. So made very famous, by the Ottomans, who some of them, they very much recruited out of places like Serbia, again, Orthodox Christians, and even made them elite in their culture with the Janissaries as well. So it goes back hundreds of years before this in the Islamic world.
These were Americans captured at sea. In 1794, in reaction to the attacks, Congress had passed a law authorizing the payment of tribute to the Barbary states. Part of that law was the Naval Act of 1794, which authorized the construction of 6 frigates, establishing the United States Navy. By the end of the 1700s, when Jefferson was Secretary of State, the United States had concluded treaties with all of the Barbary states, the Ottoman regencies of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, along with independent Morocco. When Congress authorized $80,000 for Morocco to not molest American shipping, it was considered a good deal, as it was a cost savings when compared to the loss of ships,
Because it was so
cargo, and
successful.
sailors. The Bey of Algiers, Mustafa Baba, also agreed, and many American merchantmen were escorted by Portuguese warships, as Portugal also had a treaty with the Islamic states. But Jefferson was opposed to paying tribute, which he considered to be a modern Danegeld, when Saxon England paid the Danish Vikings not to attack.
Like
It did not
negotiating
work.
with terrorists.
Although Morocco and Algiers initially agreed, just weeks before Jefferson took office, Tripoli began attacking American merchant ships in an attempt to extract further tribute. Jefferson had seen enough.
Interestingly, part of the treaties that come out of that was the United States in those treaties declaring that they are not a Christian nation. Heard that before, used as people that like to cite in the debate between is the U.S. a Christian nation or not. In the treaty, it was like signs saying like United States is not a Christian official, like an official religion. You know what I mean? I forget which treaty that was. Treaty of Tripoli. I have to look into that. But yeah, look into it. It's just interesting take.
Jefferson tried diplomacy.
Not really
in his
take,
letter
just
to Pasha
part of
Yusuf
history.
Karamanli emphasized our sincere desire to cultivate peace and commerce with your subjects. Pasha Karamanli, the ruler of modern-day Tunisia, felt that the Americans had insulted him by not offering to pay tribute. He threatened continued actions if not so respected. Pasha Karamanli was already at war with Sweden, having broken an existing treaty after Sweden agreed to pay annual tribute and ransom for 131 captives. 14 Swedish merchantmen had been seized by Tripolitan corsairs. Some of these were white women who were being transported on Swedish merchantmen. and it is not known if they were ever recovered, as the white women were rarely ransomed. They were highly prized and sold. The Pasha then declared war on the United States on May 14, 1801, by chopping down the flagpole at the American consulate in Tripoli, a direct act of war.
I bet there's a lot of stuff you didn't know. This was stuff that I had learned about much later in my actual academic, like when I was learning, when I was a student, was a lot of this stuff. I mean, again, have you heard about this stuff? War with, Tunisia? Fascinating. But yeah, there's a lot that's come out of that again is being now, I think, talked about more and cited, especially because I was telling you about how in the treaties and stuff, it was declaring about official religion and stuff like that. United States and their treaty, basically saying we're not officially a religious, have state religion, not necessarily a Christian religion. You have heard a lot of people cite that and kind of that, argument that happens today.
Jefferson sent 3 frigates and a schooner under the command of U.S. Navy Commodore Richard Dale as a show of force and to protect U.S. ships entering the Mediterranean through the Straits of Gibraltar. Dale learned of the declaration when he reached Gibraltar on July 1st, 1801. From that point, Dale's ships blocked 2 of the Pasha's corsairs operating as raiders and messengers inside the harbor. Yusuf Karamanli was shocked at the American audacity. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Selim III in Istanbul, was also less than amused, yet did not interfere when the Americans became involved. He had just concluded treaties with Russia and Austria and was trying to westernize his empire along Western lines.
The Ottoman Empire is struggling at this time. Their modernization approach and stuff like that and lack of there caused a lot of civil disputes between people that were against that, against modernization, because they took modernization and industrialization to basically mean westernization, which would be, they felt, a degrading of their own culture. So Ottoman Empire was really, really dealing with their own issues. There, you might have heard of this term that the Ottoman Empire was called the sick man of Europe because of their, many issues they were dealing with.
This included eliminating the white slave trade. And this position was not favored by many of his subordinate regional leaders, especially in North Africa, and they launched a revolt against him and his cousin and successor,
Sounds
Mustafa
like the U.S.
IV,
and their slavery
had him
dilemma.
murdered in 1807. He was not about to give up such a lucrative business. The U.S. blockades halted Barbary trade and raids with Europe, but did not stop Tripoli's trade with the other Barbary states. It did, however, incite the other rulers, who considered siding with the Pasha, and they expelled their American diplomats. The United States was putting a major dent into their pirate enterprises, to include the white slave trade. The possibility of Tunis, Algiers, and Morocco joining forces as a result of losing this lucrative business became a serious concern during 1802, but in 1803, Captain Edward Preble was the new American naval commander, and he was aware of the white slave trade and piracy.
I'm learning a lot more of the
began to
specific
deal with it.
details of this
On
too. As
September
I'm
12,
doing that, that's why I'm probably a little quiet
the USS
right now.
Constitution arrived off the Barbary coast to confront the Tripolitan pirates. In October 1803, the frigate USS Philadelphia ran aground and was attacked and seized, and the 307-man crew was held for ransom. In response, on February 16, 1804, a group under Navy Lieutenant Stephen Decatur slipped into Tripoli harbor after dark, boarded and set fires that destroyed the Philadelphia. The Pasha, in response,
The American
demanded
Trojan
an
horse.
outrageous sum in ransom for his American hostages, even threatening death if it was not paid. In 1804, Commodore Samuel Barron, aboard the USS President, took command of 11 vessels, and he had new orders. But due to illness, he handed command of the squadron to Captain John Rogers. Jefferson had again seen enough and decided to take direct and immediate action. He sent the order. Ex-Consul William Eaton, a former Army captain who used the title of general, and United States Marine Corps First Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon would lead a force of 8 U.S. Marines and 500 mercenaries to take Derna and free any hostages.
See him talking about, at this point in history, how much more investment there is in the United States Navy. Remember, the United States Navy was basically non-existent in like the American Revolution and things like that. That's why the French were of so much help for the U.S. And having even just standing militaries in general here in the early 1800s was just not a part of United States of how they did with that. You'd be surprised to see how low standing Army and Navy and was there. So you can see the United States really trying to keep up with that. even when the Ottoman Empire was not, I mean, they're not really talking about things in the context of this is all the Ottoman Empire is doing, because that wasn't really the case. You saw a lot of these people, they're Barbary pirates. They're working, on their own volition, right? And the Ottoman Empire was not necessarily a naval power like that, especially as compared to the great European naval powers at this time.
These mercenaries were Greeks from Crete, Arabs, and Berbers, opposed to the regime, and started on a march across the desert from Alexandria, Egypt in April 1805.
That's
Their
a crappy
objective was to
march.
capture the Tripolitan city of Derna. The Muslim troops were under the command of Egyptian Sheikh El Tahib, the Ottoman Empire viceroy. William Eaton, who was overbearing and not very friendly, kept himself aloof from his men and was in overall command but leading only half the group. He had a tough job controlling the largely undisciplined mercenaries, and the infighting between the Christian Greeks and Muslims, few of whom were professional soldiers, became a problem.
This is just
His
common
promises of money and loot
throughout the whole
once they
Ottoman
took Derna
Empire
was
and
looked
everything.
upon skeptically.
So much
However,
infighting.
O'Bannon and his 8 Marines embedded with their mercenaries shared food, hardship, water, and earned their trust. O'Bannon decided to take the Muslims from Eaton, exchanging them for his Greeks. The Marines built a strong fellowship by not denigrating the Islamic faith. They discussed their similarities and differences. O'Bannon also knew that many of these men had either been hostages themselves or had lost friends and family to the white slave trade. Eaton reported in May 1805, quote, "Our only provisions are a handful of rice and 2 biscuits a day," end quote. From March 22nd to March 30th, several Arab mercenaries under the command of Sheikh Hamid El Tahib staged mutinies. By April 8, when he crossed the border into Libya and Tripoli, Eaton had quelled the Arab mutinies, but he could not stop the desertions. In late April, his army finally reached the port city of Bomba, some miles up the coast from Derna, where U.S. Navy warships USS Argus, Nautilus, and Hornet, with Commodore James Barron and Captain Isaac Hull, were waiting for him. Eaton received fresh supplies and the money to pay his mercenaries. Argus gave an additional cannon to the troops. On April 26, Captain Hull's ships then opened fire and bombarded Derna's batteries for an hour. Meanwhile, Eaton divided his remaining army into 2 separate attacking parties. The attack began at 14:45 hours, with Lieutenant O'Bannon and his Marines leading the attack with 50 inexperienced Greek gunners. Eaton's force was halted due to high volumes of enemy musket fire.
So I've noticed this video is far more about the military. It's much more military history, obviously. It's not talking really a lot about the slave trade itself, other and just the military intervention the United States was doing to try to intervene and stop that process. I really haven't heard anything about, again, like slave conditions, terms, how the slave, just it's really not a lot about slavery actually, but and the context is very much, it looks like, very narrow. It's not like an overview of the history of white slave trade. Hopefully I've been able to interject some of those things, but so I was kind of expecting more of it,
pushed his men through
the actual
inaccurate fire, as
slavery
witnessed from the
itself.
ships. Carefully interchanging his men into various ranks to fire, advance, reload, and continue the process, O'Bannon's force took the fort cannons. Eaton, wounded in the left wrist, would report later that O'Bannon, with his Marines and Greeks, had, quote, passed through a shower of musketry from the walls of houses, took possession of the battery, end quote. Eaton's forces caught up and turned the defenders' own abandoned guns against them, pushing them out of the city and into a well-placed ambush set up by O'Bannon just outside the main gate. During the entire battle, O'Bannon lost 2 men killed and 3 wounded Marines,
Just show you
with
though
9
that
of his mercenaries killed.
small,
Eaton's
unorganized
losses among the Muslims is unknown.
nature
O'Bannon
of
raised the flag
the
over
American
captured
naval
city
military.
At 1600 hours. They had just defeated a force 4 times their number, who were in a fortified defensive posture. And for the first time in American history, that a flag from the United States had been raised on foreign soil. Hostages were freed, and the Navy sank the pirate ships in harbor. Accurate naval fire from
Well, yeah, I guess so. In the whole raising the flag thing. I mean, Western expansion. I mean, you would have to consider that foreign lands, and every foreign land they went into, in the eastward expansion would essentially be planting your flag on, foreign ground. But I guess it's not really being considered in this, at least it doesn't seem to be the subject. But yeah, I mean, I see what they're saying. It's going there and like a official military victory against established powers, and what the ideas of what Americans would consider like an established power, like the territory of the Ottoman Empire.
Argus and the other ships forced them back, and Derna remained in American hands. Yusuf reluctantly signed a peace treaty on June 10, 1805, aboard the USS Constitution. The treaty granted American ships passage through the Mediterranean without further payments of tribute and freedom from harassment. This also meant joining the other European nations in halting the very active and overt white slave trade. The war was over, and so was active white slavery from North Africa. Marine Corps legend has it that Hamet presented O'Bannon with a Mameluke sword.
It was the ceremonial swords. My dad was a Marine, and he had this sword you're all interested in, that they use, actually fighting back, like way back, but not in the, modern day. But yeah, that gave me some nostalgia there.
Emboldened by this event, more European nations also increased their naval presence and resisted the Barbary pirates.
Damn.
Stopped paying tribute, crippling their commercial trade and extortion rackets, ending their raids on southern coastal Europe, ending hostage taking, and their demand for ransoms and the white slave trade.
Now
Presley O'Bannon and his 8 Marines had done the seemingly impossible. But it would not be the last time Marines were called upon to do the impossible and succeed. Semper Fi.
We hope you enjoyed this segment of Forgotten History. Please click like and subscribe for free.
American military enthusiasts.
And be engaged and informed. Send us comments if you have questions or even show ideas, and we will respond to all requests and comments as soon as we can. Thank you.
All right, final thoughts. All right, so this video really, I mean, the title is The Truth About the White Slave Trade. I feel like that's not really what this covered much at all. It did give a little bit about, like, I mean, the rules of slavery. I mean, he did mention in Islamic law that you can't enslave, other Muslims, which definitely made, white people across the whole Mediterranean Atlantic region, since they were, largely Christian, kind of being the target about that. But I guess it was really more just about, I mean, it was really just a video about, the Americans going to war with North African Barbary states, really. And I was hoping for maybe a little bit more slave trade history, because again, even with that, it focused on just kind of the turn of the century there. Okay, late 1700s, early 1800s, without really a deep dive into the actual history of white slavery. So, probably we can look elsewhere there. Hopefully I was able to add, I mean, a little bit of the context, so we could add on to this of going a little bit deeper and more of the actual history of slave trade. So like if the thesis of this was the truth about the white slave trade, I mean, I guess what we come out with, all we really come out with it is that there were Americans taken from pirates from North Africa, and that's really the white slave trade. And even then, it's not really as much of a slave trade. I mean, they're capturing for their own doing within their own states and empires, rather than, shipping them across the different sides of the planet like the transatlantic slave trade was. But it did touch on a history of, a small chunk of white slavery that does not get talked about very much. Even us as an American, this is not something that gets brought up really much at all. I mean, you really heard about, the Barbary states and the conflict with that. I know as part of like when I taught U.S. history, because I teach most all world history right now, but when I was teaching specifically U.S. history, it's not really part of the curriculum, mostly because the effects of it were not changing American society. I mean, the amount of slaves, people enslaved, Americans, whatever, being enslaved there was pretty minuscule in comparison to the effect it had on American society, especially because so many slaves were brought in rather than actually enslaved coming out of the United States and the colonial era of the Americas. So anyway, but overall, I learned a lot about the specific conflict that kind of went down there. A lot of military stuff about what those battles and things looked like. So that was what more I took away from this, was that military engagement there, much more than I think about history of slavery in there. And that's fine too. You know, I love to learn everything about everything. That's what I do. So anyways, what did you think about this? What do you think about, I guess, the role and kind of the what was going on with slavery at this time, and what did this teach us, and how does it fit in with the history of slavery in general? Definitely let me know about that. Put it down in a comment down below. All right, thanks again to Forgotten History for being cool with me filming a reaction to that. And make sure you're supporting that. Give that a view over there. If you had not seen this video, make sure you're giving the view. If you like what they were doing here, definitely subscribe. Looks like a lot of other military stuff done by, military content creators. So that's up your alley. Probably check out more of their stuff. All right, and with that, we'll see you next time. Bye.